The bullet that ended Chester Keating's career as the fastest draw in the territory never touched a soul. It happened on a windless afternoon in the spring of 1878, in the dusty street outside the Silver Spur Saloon in Cheyenne, Wyoming Territory, when a boy no older than 19 named Dale Hutton stepped into the road and called Chester's name in a voice that cracked with nerves he could not hide. Chester had seen 100 men try to work up the courage to draw against him, and he had learned to read the fear in their eyes the way other men read a newspaper. Dale Hutton's hand trembled over the grip of his father's old Colt, and Chester understood in that instant that the boy did not want to be there at all. Someone had put him up to it. Someone had told him that killing the man called Keating would make him a legend, and the boy had believed it because he was young enough to believe such foolish things. Chester drew anyway because that was the game, and because a man who hesitated in that street was a man who ended up in the ground. His hand moved faster than thought, faster than the eye could follow, and his pistol was leveled and cocked before Dale Hutton had even cleared leather. The boy froze. His gun hung half-drawn, his fingers shaking, his face gone the color of old ash. Chester did not fire. He stood there in the settling dust with his Colt pointed at a boy who could not have hit the side of a barn from 10 paces, and something inside him that had been slowly cracking for 3 years finally broke clean through. He holstered his weapon, turned, and walked into the saloon without another word, leaving Dale Hutton standing in the street with his gun still half out of its holster, and his whole body shaking with the relief of a man who had just realized how close he had come to dying for nothing. That night, sitting alone with a bottle he did not finish, Chester Keating decided he was done. 26 men had fallen to his gun over 11 years, and he had told himself for a long time that every one of them had drawn first, that every killing had been a fair fight in a fair territory where fair fights were sometimes the only law a man had. But he was 34 years old, and he had no wife, no children, no house that was truly his own, and no memory of the last time he had slept a full night without one ear listening for footsteps outside his door. He had built a name so fearsome that boys like Dale Hutton would risk their lives trying to take it from him, and he understood, finally, that a name like that was not a possession. It was a debt that never stopped collecting interest, paid in the blood of strangers who wanted to be somebody, right up until the day somebody finally beat him to the draw, and Chester Keating became nothing more than a story other men told in saloons. He rode out of Cheyenne before sunrise the next morning with his saddlebags packed light, and his reputation left behind him like a skin he had finally managed to shed. Though he knew, even then, that skins like that had a way of growing back if a man was not careful. He rode north and west for the better part of 3 weeks, sleeping under the stars more often than not, working his way through the high plains and the foothills, taking a day's labor here and there in exchange for a meal and a place to rest his horse. He did not tell anyone his name if he could avoid it. He wanted, for the first time in longer than he could remember, to simply be a man passing through, unremarkable and unremarked upon, a stranger whose face nobody would recognize from a wanted poster or a penny dreadful. That was how he came to the town of Larkspur, Wyoming Territory, on a hot afternoon in the middle of June, with the Laramie Mountains blue and hazy on the horizon, and a wind that smelled of sage and dry grass blowing steady across the flats. Larkspur was a small town, the kind that existed because a creek ran through it, and a handful of families had decided that was reason enough to stay. There was a general store, a livery, a church with a bell that had cracked 2 winters back and never been replaced, and a saloon that also served, on Sundays, as the only place in town large enough to hold a meeting of the whole community. Chester had ridden through 100 towns just like it, and he expected Larkspur to pass beneath his boots the same way all the others had, a place to water his horse and buy a sack of flour before he moved on toward nowhere in particular. He had not expected to find Virginia Prescott standing in the middle of the road outside the general store, her chin lifted and her eyes flashing, facing down 3 mounted men twice her size, while she held a hay rake in both hands like she meant to use it. "You tell Mr. Grant," she was saying, in a voice that shook only slightly, "that the water on my land belongs to my land, and he can dig himself a well on his own property same as any honest man would." The man in front, a broad-shouldered rider with a drooping mustache and a tin star-shaped badge pinned crooked to his vest that Chester recognized immediately as no lawman's badge at all, but a private brand of intimidation some ranch owners like to hand out to their hired men, leaned forward in his saddle. "Mr. Grant don't take kindly to being called dishonest, Miss Prescott," the man said. "And a woman alone with 4 young ones to feed ought to think real careful before she goes making enemies of the man who owns half this county." "I am not alone," Virginia said. "I have my niece and my nephews, and I have this rake, and I have every right this territory grants me to the water that runs through my own land, and I will not be moved off it by a man too much of a coward to come and tell me himself instead of sending his hired boys to do his talking." Chester had stopped his horse at the edge of the street without quite deciding to, and he found himself studying the woman the way he might once have studied an opponent, though for entirely different reasons. She could not have been more than 26 years old, with dark hair pulled back beneath a plain bonnet, and a face that might have been called merely pretty if it were not, in that moment, so thoroughly transformed by fury into something closer to magnificent. Behind her, half hidden in the doorway of the general store, 3 children watched with wide, frightened eyes, the oldest a girl of perhaps 13 with her arms wrapped protectively around a small boy no more than 5. The lead rider's hand drifted toward the pistol at his hip, not drawing it, but resting there in a manner clearly meant to remind the woman of what lay beneath his palm. Chester was off his horse before he had fully decided to move. "That seems like an unfriendly way to talk to a lady," he said, and his voice carried across the street with the particular calm that had once made grown men's knees go weak, though he had not intended it that way. Had not intended anything except to put himself between that man's hand and that woman standing with her children behind her. The 3 riders turned. The lead man's eyes ran over Chester, taking in the plain gray shirt, the trail dust, the ordinary look of a man who might have been anybody, until his eyes reached the low-slung holster and the particular worn pattern of the leather, and something shifted in his expression. "This ain't your business, stranger," the man said, though with noticeably less certainty than a moment before. "I expect you're right," Chester said. "But I've got a powerful habit of making other people's business mine when 3 grown men decide to threaten a woman and her children over water rights. Seems like the kind of thing a man ought to speak up about, even when it isn't strictly his to speak on." The man's hand moved an inch closer to his gun, and Chester's own hand had not moved at all, had not needed to move, because 11 years of reputation lived in the way. A man held himself even when he was doing nothing whatsoever with his hands, and something in the stillness of Chester Keating's shoulders told that rider, more clearly than any words could have, exactly what kind of mistake he would be making if his fingers closed around that grip. The silence stretched. A dog barked somewhere down the street. Virginia Prescott stood with her rake still raised, watching this stranger with an expression that mixed wariness with something almost like relief, though she did not lower her weapon an inch. "You don't know who you're crossing," the lead rider finally said, but he had already begun to turn his horse. "No," Chester agreed, "and I expect I don't much care. But you go on and tell Mr. Grant that if he wants this lady's water, he can come and ask her himself, like a neighbor, instead of sending men to scare children in the street." The 3 riders wheeled their horses and rode off down the road toward the west, raising a cloud of dust that drifted slowly across the town in the hot afternoon air, and Chester Keating stood there a moment longer, watching them go, before he turned to find Virginia Prescott studying him with narrowed eyes. "I did not ask for your help," she said. It was not the response he had expected, and something about the sharp independence in her voice made him almost smile, though he kept his face carefully neutral. "No, ma'am, you didn't," he said, "but it looked like you might have used it anyway." "I had the rake," she said, and there was the faintest suggestion of humor beneath the bristling pride, though she seemed unwilling to let it show fully. "I noticed," Chester said. "I imagine you'd have done some damage with it, too." She studied him a moment longer, her eyes traveling, as the writer's had, to the low holster at his hip, and he watched her expression shift from wariness into something colder and more guarded, and he understood, without being told, exactly what she was thinking, because he had seen that particular look on faces before. She was thinking that she recognized the type, even if she did not recognize the man. She was thinking that a gun that moved that easily in a man's mind belonged to a certain kind of trouble, the kind that made trouble follow wherever it went, and she had 3 children behind her in that doorway who did not need any more trouble in their lives than they already carried. "Thank you for your assistance," she said, in a tone that made it clear the conversation, and whatever gratitude she owed him, was now concluded. "Good day to you, sir." She gathered her children, herded them gently but firmly into the store, and left Chester Keating standing alone in the dusty street of Larkspur with the peculiar, unfamiliar feeling of having done something right for once without expecting anything in return, and finding that the not expecting anything did not stop him from wanting to. He told himself he would ride on the next morning. He told himself this town was no different from 100 others, and that whatever trouble was brewing between the woman named Virginia Prescott and the man named Grant was not his concern, that he had left that life behind him on a dusty street in Cheyenne and had no business picking up any new burdens, least of all ones with 3 children and a woman's cold suspicion attached to them. But he found the livery in Larkspur run by an old, one-eyed man named Obed Fisk, who was glad enough of an extra pair of hands and a strong back, and the pay, though modest, was enough to cover a bed at the boarding house for a week, and a week seemed a reasonable enough thing to allow himself before moving on, and so Chester Keating did not ride out the next morning after all. He learned the story of Virginia Prescott in pieces, the way small towns tell their stories, a little from Obed Fisk while they mended a broken wagon wheel together, a little more from the woman who ran the boarding house, a widow named Mrs. Coyle who liked to talk while she served supper. Virginia had come to Larkspur 3 years before, when her sister Eleanor and Eleanor's husband had taken up a homestead claim along Larkspur Creek, hoping to build a life raising cattle and putting up hay in the rich bottomland along the water. Virginia herself had been unmarried, living with them, helping with the children as Eleanor's family grew, and when the fever came through the territory in the terrible summer of 1876, it took both Eleanor and her husband within the same week, leaving behind 4 children and a homestead claim that, by the strange and often unjust workings of territorial law, very nearly passed out of the family's hands entirely, since a woman's claim to land, even land she had worked with her own 2 hands for 3 years raising her sister's orphaned children, was a thing the courts did not always recognize with any generosity. Virginia had fought for that claim through the Territorial Land Office with a persistence that had, according to Mrs. Coyle, worn out 2 circuit judges and very nearly bankrupted her in legal fees, and had finally secured it in her own name only the previous autumn, a fact that had made her, in the eyes of a cattle baron named Silas Grant, who owned the largest spread in 3 counties, and who had his eye on the water rights along Larkspur Creek for his growing herds, an obstacle standing between him and the one resource his empire still lacked enough of. "He has offered to buy her out 3 times now," Mrs. Coyle said, refilling Chester's coffee without being asked. "Fair price too, or fair enough, but that woman will not sell, says it is the only thing those children have left of their mother and father and she will not take it from them for any amount of money." "And the children?" Chester asked, though he told himself the question was merely polite interest. Sarah is the oldest, 13 now, sharp as a tack and helps her aunt with everything. Thomas is 9, always underfoot, wants to be a cowboy more than he wants his supper some nights. Little Emma is 5, sweetest thing you ever saw. And there is the baby Daniel, not but 2 years old, though I suppose he is not truly a baby anymore, just small for his age. Mrs. Coyle paused, studying Chester with the particular knowing look of a woman who had spent a lifetime watching people fall into and out of love, and recognized the early signs of it long before the parties involved were willing to admit to themselves what was happening. You are asking a great many questions about a woman who told you plainly this afternoon that she wanted nothing from you. Just making conversation, Chester said. Said Mrs. Coyle, and left it at that, though the small smile she wore as she returned to her kitchen suggested she believed nothing of the sort. 3 days later, Chester rode out to the Prescott homestead on a pretext he had spent the better part of an afternoon constructing, namely that Obed Fisk had heard the Prescott windmill was making a grinding noise that suggested a bearing about to fail, and that Chester, having some experience with machinery from his years of drifting and taking whatever work came to hand, might be able to look at it before it broke entirely and left the family without water for their stock in the middle of a dry summer. Virginia met him at the edge of the yard with a rifle in her hands this time, not raised but present, and her expression made it clear she had not forgotten who he was or what manner of man she suspected him to be. "Mr. Fisk sent me," Chester said before she could speak. "Said your windmill's got a bad bearing and offered my help fixing it, seeing as I know a thing or two about machinery. I don't want anything from you, ma'am, and I'll be on my way the moment the work's done if that's your wish." She studied him for a long moment, her eyes moving from his face to the rifle in her own hands, as though only now remembering she held it, and something in her posture softened, though only slightly. "The windmill has indeed been making a terrible noise," she admitted. "I confess I do not know the first thing about repairing it." "Then I expect I can be of some use," Chester said, "if you'll allow it." She allowed it, though she watched him from the porch the entire afternoon while he worked, and the 4 children gathered at a cautious distance, whispering among themselves, until the youngest boy, Thomas, worked up the courage to approach and ask if the stranger was really as good with a gun as the men at the store had been saying. "I don't rightly know what the men at the store have been saying," Chester answered honestly, tightening a bolt with the wrench Obed had lent him. "They said you stood down 3 of Mr. Grant's men without even drawing your pistol," Thomas said, his eyes wide with the particular admiration boys of 9 years old reserve for stories of daring and danger. "They said you're the fastest gun in the whole territory." Chester glanced toward the porch, where Virginia had gone very still, clearly listening. "I used to be fast with a gun," Chester said carefully. "I'm not sure being fast with a gun is a thing worth being admired for, though, son. It's a hard way to live, and it doesn't leave a man much of anything at the end of it except a lot of quiet nights and a lot of folks who'd rather see him dead than not." Thomas considered this with the serious frown of a child working through a new and complicated idea. "But you helped Aunt Virginia. That's good, isn't it? Even if you used to be a gunslinger." "I hope so," Chester said. "I surely hope so." That evening, after he had fixed the bearing and the windmill turned smooth and quiet once more, Virginia walked him partway to where he had tied his horse, her arms crossed against the cooling evening air. "You did not have to come all the way out here for a broken windmill," she said. "Obed Fisk could have sent his own boy or come himself." "I offered," Chester said. "Seemed the neighborly thing to do." "Is that what this is, neighborly?" "I don't rightly know what else to call it," he admitted. "I saw a woman standing up to 3 armed men with nothing but a hay rake and more courage than sense, and I have not been able to stop thinking about it since. I suppose that is the plain truth of the matter, ma'am, and I did not come out here today to fix a windmill so much as I came out here to see if the woman I saw in that street was as remarkable as she appeared, or if I had simply imagined it." Virginia was quiet for a long moment, and in the fading light Chester could not read her expression clearly, though he thought, for just a moment, that something like a smile touched the corner of her mouth before she suppressed it. "I have 4 children depending on me, Mr. Keating," she said, and it was the first time she had used his name, which meant she had asked someone about him, which meant she already knew far more about his past than he had told her himself. "I cannot afford to be charmed by a man with a reputation like yours. Whatever you were in Cheyenne, whatever you may have left behind you there, I have children who need a home that is safe and stable, and far from the kind of trouble that follows men who have made 26 enemies with a fast hand and a quick trigger." 25, Chester said quietly. "The last one I let live." She looked at him sharply, and he told her in a few plain sentences about the boy in Cheyenne, about the shaking hand and the fear in the boy's eyes, and about the bottle he had not finished that night, and the decision he had made before the sun came up the next morning. He did not tell it as a story meant to win her sympathy. He told it because it seemed to him, standing there in the deepening dusk with this woman who had faced down armed men rather than give up her sister's children's home, that she deserved the plain truth more than she deserved a performance. "I'm not looking to be anybody's gunslinger anymore," he said. "I don't know exactly what I'm looking for if I'm honest with you, ma'am, but it isn't that." Virginia studied him for a long moment in the dying light, and when she finally spoke, her voice had lost some of its earlier sharpness. "There is a great deal of work that needs doing around this place before the fall," she said. "More than I can manage alone, with the children and the cattle and the hay besides. I cannot pay much. But if you are truly looking for something other than trouble, Mr. Keating, I imagine there is honest work here for a man willing to do it." "I'm willing," Chester said, and found, to his own considerable surprise, that he meant it more thoroughly than he had meant anything in a very long while. The weeks that followed fell into a rhythm that Chester had not known in more than a decade, waking before dawn to feed the stock and mend fences, working alongside Virginia through the long summer days putting up hay, and repairing the barn roof before the autumn rains came, and slowly, almost without his noticing it happening, becoming a fixture in the lives of 4 children who had lost so much already that they had learned to be careful about who they allowed themselves to love. Sarah, the oldest, remained wary of him longest, watching him with the guarded eyes of a girl who had already learned that grown men could disappear from a life without warning, whether through fever or through choices they made of their own free will, and Chester found himself taking particular care with her, never pushing, never demanding her trust, simply being present day after day, until one afternoon in late July she asked him, without preamble, whether he intended to stay. "I intend to," Chester said, "for as long as your aunt will have me and for as long as I'm useful around this place." "Everyone we love leaves," Sarah said, not unkindly, simply stating what she had observed to be true of the world. "I know it must seem that way," Chester said, "but I'll tell you something, Sarah. I spent 11 years of my life leaving places, moving on before anybody could get too used to having me around, because staying anywhere felt like asking for trouble I didn't want to bring down on decent people. I'm tired of leaving. I'd like, for once, to see what it feels like to stay somewhere long enough that leaving would actually cost me something." Sarah considered this with the same serious frown her younger brother favored, and something in her expression eased just slightly, though she did not offer him her trust outright. Not yet, not so quickly. But she did not run from the conversation either, and Chester counted that as progress enough for one afternoon. Little Emma, at 5 years old, harbored no such reservations, and had decided within the first week that Chester Keating was the finest person she had ever met, following him around the homestead, asking 100 questions an hour about horses and cattle and the mountains, and whether he had ever seen a real live bear, until Virginia would call her away with an apologetic smile toward Chester that he found himself looking forward to more than he cared to admit. Thomas, for his part, attached himself to Chester with the fierce devotion of a boy who desperately wanted a man in his life to teach him the things his own father had died too soon to teach him. How to rope a calf, how to sit a horse properly, how to read the weather in the shape of the clouds over the mountains. And Chester found himself teaching these things with a patience and a gentleness that surprised him, given how little patience or gentleness his own life had required of him in longer than he cared to remember. And little Daniel, not yet 2 years old and too small to understand much of anything about gunslingers or reputations, or the complicated history that had brought this quiet stranger into their lives, simply reached his small arms up toward Chester whenever he came near. And Chester found that this small, uncomplicated trust affected him more powerfully than anything else in his life had in a very long time. It was Virginia herself who took the longest to warm, though warm she did slowly, over the course of that summer, in the small moments that accumulate between two people working side by side day after day. A shared laugh over Thomas's stubborn refusal to admit he had fallen off his pony rather than dismounted on purpose. A quiet conversation on the porch after the children were asleep about her sister Elena, and the life they had once imagined they would build together in this territory. A moment in the kitchen when their hands brushed reaching for the same dish towel, and neither of them moved away quite as quickly as propriety might have suggested they should. "You are good with them," Virginia said one evening in early August, watching Chester help Thomas mend a bridle by lamplight while Emma slept curled against his side on the porch swing. "The children, I mean. I did not expect that from a man with your history." "I don't suppose anybody expected it," Chester said, "including me. I spent so many years telling myself I wasn't the kind of man who could have a home, a family, any of it. Seemed easier to believe that than to want something I was afraid I'd never get to keep. And now—" Chester considered the question carefully before answering, watching Thomas's small hands work the leather with fierce concentration, watching Emma's chest rise and fall in peaceful sleep against his arm. "Now I think maybe I was wrong," he said, "about a great many things." Virginia did not respond to this directly, but she did not look away from him either, and something passed between them in the lamplight that neither of them was quite ready to name aloud, though both of them felt it, and both of them, in their own private thoughts that night, allowed themselves to wonder what it might mean. The town of Larkspur held a harvest dance in the middle of September, in the same building that served as church on Sundays and meeting hall on other occasions, and Virginia surprised herself by asking Chester, with more nervousness than she cared to admit even to herself, whether he intended to attend. "I hadn't thought much on it," Chester said, though this was not entirely true, as he had in fact thought a great deal about whether such an invitation might be forthcoming, and had spent no small amount of time deciding what he would say if it was. "I don't dance much, never had much occasion to learn." "I could teach you," Virginia said, and then, as though startled by her own boldness, added quickly, "That is, if you wish to learn. The children would enjoy the dance, and it would be a shame for you to sit against the wall all evening while they have their fun." Chester agreed, and spent 2 evenings that week in the yard of the homestead being taught the rudiments of a waltz by a woman who laughed more freely than he had yet heard her laugh, as he stepped on her feet with the same clumsy determination he had once brought to learning the fast draw, though with considerably less natural talent for this particular skill. The dance itself, when it came, was a bright and cheerful affair, lanterns strung along the rafters of the meeting hall, and a fiddler from a neighboring homestead playing reels and waltzes late into the night, while half the town of Larkspur turned out in their best clothes to celebrate the harvest and the coming of autumn. Chester wore a clean shirt Mrs. Coyle had helped him press, and when he led Virginia onto the floor for the first waltz, he felt the eyes of the town upon them and felt, for the first time in longer than he could remember, that he did not mind being seen, did not mind being known, because the woman in his arms was worth whatever attention their dancing together might draw. "You have improved," Virginia said, laughing softly as he managed a full turn without stumbling. "I had a good teacher," Chester said. Patient, too, considering how many times I stepped on her feet. I did not mind, Virginia said, and then more quietly so that only he could hear it over the music. I have not minded very much of anything about you, Chester Keating, though I confess that troubles me some, given all the reasons I once had to keep my distance. What reasons are those? Chester asked, though he suspected he already knew. My sister's husband, Virginia said, her voice dropping lower still, died of the fever, same as she did, but before that, years before, when we first came out to this territory. He told me once that he had ridden with a rough crowd in his younger days, men who lived by the gun, and that he counted himself fortunate to have escaped that life with his soul more or less intact, because he had seen good men consumed by it. Men who started out no different than any other cowboy looking for work, and ended up unable to find their way back to anything resembling an ordinary life. I suppose some part of me feared, when I first saw you standing in that street with your hand so easy near your gun, that you might be a man who had gone too far down that road ever to find his way back. And now? Chester asked, echoing the question she had asked him weeks before. Now I think perhaps some men find their way back further than anyone would have guessed possible, Virginia said, if they have good enough reason to want to. They danced 3 more times that evening, and walked home beneath a sky thick with more stars than Chester had ever quite noticed before, the children trailing sleepily behind them. And though neither of them spoke of it directly, both of them understood, by the time they reached the homestead gate, that something had shifted between them that night, something neither of them was willing to lose. It was not, however, a shift that Silas Grant intended to allow to stand unchallenged. The trouble began in earnest the week after the harvest dance, when Virginia woke one morning to find a section of fence along the creek torn down, and a dozen head of Grant's cattle grazing on her hay ground, trampling the last cutting she had counted on to see her stock through the winter. Chester rode the fence line with her that morning, his jaw tight with a fury he had not felt in longer than he cared to admit, and found the cut wire deliberate, clean, done with tools rather than the accidental work of a storm or a careless hand. This wasn't an accident, Chester said, crouching to examine the severed wire. No, Virginia agreed, her voice tight with the particular exhaustion of a woman who had been fighting this same fight for longer than she cared to remember. Grant has done this before, though never quite so boldly. He is testing to see how far he can push, now that word has gotten around that you are staying here. I expect he wants to know whether your presence changes anything, or whether he can still push me off this land the way he has been trying to for 3 years. It changes something, Chester said quietly, and Virginia looked at him sharply. I do not want you fighting my battles with a gun, Chester, she said. I have told you already, I cannot have that kind of trouble following this family. If Grant wants a fight, I want it fought in the land office and the courthouse, not in the street. I know it, Chester said, and I mean to fight it that way if that way is open to us. But I won't pretend I don't intend to stand between you and any man who thinks he can tear down your fences and run his cattle over your hay ground without consequence. There's a difference between drawing a gun on a man and standing firm enough that he thinks twice before trying you again. They rebuilt the fence together that day, and the next, and Chester rode into Larkspur to speak with the sheriff, a weathered, sensible man named Sheriff Boone, who had held the office for 11 years and had grown tired in that time of watching Silas Grant use his wealth and his hired men to push around smaller landholders throughout the county. I have suspected Grant of worse than torn-down fences for a good while now, Sheriff Boone admitted, leaning back in his chair with a weary sigh. But suspecting and proving are 2 different matters, Mr. Keating, and Grant has enough money to keep good lawyers between himself and any trouble his hired men might get up to. I have tried twice now to bring charges against him for the harassment of Miss Prescott, and both times the territorial prosecutor found insufficient evidence to proceed. Then we need evidence, Chester said, something that ties the cut fence and the loose cattle directly back to Grant's ranch, not just his hired men. If you can get it, Sheriff Boone said. "I will see it put before the circuit judge myself, and gladly. This county has had enough of Silas Grant believing the law does not apply to a man of his standing." It was Sarah, in the end, 13 years old and sharp as a tack, just as Mrs. Coyle had described her, who provided the evidence that broke the matter open, having taken to watching the fence line herself in the early mornings with an old spyglass that had belonged to her father, and who caught sight, one gray dawn in late September, of two of Grant's hired men deliberately cutting the wire and driving cattle through the gap, an act she observed clearly enough, and at close enough range, to identify both men by name and to note the distinctive brand on the cattle they drove. Thick black smoke rising from her aunt's chimney in the background of the scene as proof of exactly where and when the incident had occurred. "I wrote it all down," Sarah said proudly, presenting Chester and Virginia with a carefully composed account in her own neat handwriting, dated and detailed with the precision of a girl who had clearly given considerable thought to exactly what a court of law might require. "Just like you would give testimony, Aunt Virginia. I thought it might help." "It might help a great deal," Chester said, studying the girl's careful account with genuine admiration. "You did a fine thing here, Sarah. A brave thing, too, getting up before dawn to watch that fence line alone." Sarah flushed with pleasure at the praise, and something in her guarded reserve toward Chester eased visibly in that moment, as though she had finally decided, after weeks of careful observation, that this was a man worth trusting after all. Sheriff Boone took Sarah's written account, along with corroborating testimony from Obed Fisk, who had happened to see the same two hired men riding hard away from the Prescott land that same morning with wire cutters visible in their saddlebags, and rode out to serve papers on Silas Grant himself. A confrontation that Chester heard about secondhand, but which apparently involved Grant blustering a great deal about his standing in the county, before ultimately backing down, when Sheriff Boone made it clear he intended to see the matter before the circuit judge regardless of any objections Grant cared to raise. The circuit judge, when he arrived in Larkspur 3 weeks later on his regular rounds through the territory, heard the matter in a courtroom crowded with more of the town's residents than Chester had ever seen gathered in one place, most of them small landholders themselves who had grown weary, over the years, of watching a man like Silas Grant use his wealth to push around anyone who stood in the way of his ambitions. Virginia testified with a steady, clear voice about the years of harassment, the torn fences, the loose cattle, the threats delivered through hired men too cowardly to speak for themselves, and Sarah testified as well, sitting very straight in the witness chair with her hands folded in her lap, describing exactly what she had seen that gray dawn morning with a precision that left little room for doubt. The judge found in Virginia's favor decisively, ordering Grant to pay restitution for the destroyed hay and the damaged fence, and issuing a formal injunction that made clear any further harassment of the Prescott homestead would result in criminal charges rather than merely civil ones. It was not, perhaps, complete justice for 3 years of fear and struggle, but it was justice enough to matter, and Chester watched Virginia's shoulders ease, in the courtroom that day, with a burden she had carried alone for far too long finally beginning to lift. Silas Grant himself, seated at the back of the courtroom throughout the proceedings, said nothing when the judge delivered his ruling, but the look he cast toward Chester Keating on his way out of the building carried a weight of resentment that suggested the matter, in Grant's own mind at least, was far from settled. Grant was not a man accustomed to losing, and Chester understood, watching him go, that a man like that, humiliated in front of the entire county, would not simply accept defeat and move quietly on. He would look for another way to win, and Chester's instincts, honed over 11 years of reading danger in the set of another man's shoulders, told him that whatever Grant intended next would be considerably more dangerous than a cut fence and some trampled hay. He was proven right within the month. It came in the form of a man named Wade Colton, who rode into Larkspur on a gray gelding one bright October afternoon and took a room at the boarding house under his own name, a name that Chester recognized immediately, because Wade Colton had once, some 6 years earlier, been counted among the fastest guns in the territory, a reputation second only to Chester's own, and the two men had crossed paths more than once in the years before Chester had given up the life entirely. Though they had never drawn against each other, each having sufficient respect for the other's skill to avoid a confrontation, neither was entirely certain of winning. Mrs. Coyle mentioned the new arrival to Chester over supper with obvious concern, describing a hard-eyed man who had asked pointed questions about a former gunslinger now working the Prescott homestead, and Chester felt the old familiar coldness settle into his stomach, the particular dread of a man who understood that his past, however thoroughly he believed he had left it behind, had finally caught up with him. He rode into Larkspur the next morning and found Wade Colton exactly where he expected, at the saloon, nursing a whiskey with the patient stillness of a man who had learned long ago that hunting required patience above all else. "Keating," Wade Colton said without turning as Chester approached, "heard you'd gone soft, farming, they say, raising some widow's orphans like a common nursemaid. I heard you'd taken up hiring your gun out to men too rich and too cowardly to fight their own battles," Chester said. "Grant send you, or did you come looking on your own account?" Wade Colton finally turned, and Chester saw in his eyes the same hard, calculating look he had seen in 100 men before him, a man who had built his entire sense of himself around being fast and dangerous, and who could not abide the existence of another man whose reputation for the same skills had always, in every telling of the old stories, been ranked slightly above his own. "Grant pays well," Wade Colton said, "but I confess I came for more than his money, Keating. I've heard for 6 years now that you were faster than me, that folks talked about you the way they never talked about me, and I never got the chance to settle the question proper, because you went and quit before I could call you out fair and square. Now I hear you're back in the game, standing up to Grant's men in the street like the old days. Seemed like fate handing me exactly the chance I've been waiting for." "I'm not in any game," Chester said. "I quit, same as you heard. I don't intend to draw against you, Colton, not over some old argument about who's faster, and not for Grant's money either." "That's a shame," Wade Colton said, setting down his glass with deliberate care, "because Grant's paid me to make sure that Prescott woman finally sells her land, one way or another, and if the fastest gun in the territory won't come out and defend her proper, I don't suppose there's much standing between me and getting that job done quick and quiet." The threat was unmistakable, and Chester felt the old cold clarity settle over him, the same feeling that had once preceded every gunfight of his career, though this time it was tangled up with something new and far more powerful than mere professional calculation, a fierce and desperate need to protect people who had come to matter to him more than his own life. "You come near that homestead," Chester said, his voice low and level, "and you'll find out exactly how fast I still am Colton. I gave up drawing on frightened boys who never should have been handed a gun in the first place. I have not given up drawing on men who threaten a woman and 4 children who never did a soul any harm." Wade Colton smiled, a thin, satisfied expression that suggested this was precisely the answer he had been hoping to provoke. "Tomorrow, then," he said, "noon, in the street outside this very saloon, same as the old days. Everybody in town can come watch if they've a mind to, and we'll finally settle which one of us truly deserves the reputation." "I won't meet you for a reputation," Chester said, "but I'll meet you if that's what it takes to make you leave that family alone for good." He rode back to the homestead that evening with a heaviness in his chest that had nothing to do with fear for himself, and everything to do with fear for what might happen to Virginia and the children if he lost, or if his victory somehow drew even worse trouble down upon them in the aftermath. He found Virginia on the porch waiting, as though she had somehow sensed that something had shifted, and when he told her about Wade Colton and Grant's renewed determination, she went very still, her face pale in the lamplight. "You cannot meet him," she said. "Chester, please. I have already lost too many people I love to violence and to fever and to this hard, unforgiving territory. I cannot lose you too, not now, not when I have only just allowed myself to imagine a future that includes you in it." The word love hung in the air between them, spoken in the heat of fear rather than in any planned declaration, and both of them seemed to recognize, in the silence that followed, that it had been said and could not be unsaid, and that neither of them wished to take it back regardless. "I don't intend to lose," Chester said gently, taking her hands in his. "I have never lost, Virginia, not once in 11 years, and I am not fool enough to believe my luck will hold forever if I keep courting danger. But I do not see another way through this. Wade Colton will not simply ride away and leave you be, not with Grant's money in his pocket and his pride demanding satisfaction. If I do not meet him, he will find some other way to trouble this family, and I could not live with myself if harm came to you or the children because I was too afraid to face a man I have faced down a dozen times before in my mind, if never in fact." "And if he is faster?" Virginia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What becomes of us then?" Chester had no easy answer for this, because he had asked himself the same question throughout the long ride home, and had found, to his own surprise, that the answer that mattered most to him was not fear for his own life, but fear of what his death might mean for a family that had already buried too many people they loved. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I know that I love you, Virginia Prescott, and I love those children as though they were my own, and I would rather face Wade Colton in that street tomorrow than spend the rest of my life wondering what might have happened to you if I had run from this fight instead." Virginia wept then, quietly, and Chester held her on the porch beneath the cold October stars while the children slept inside, unaware of the danger gathering around them, and neither of them slept much that night, though both of them, in their own private thoughts, began turning over the same desperate question. Was there some way through this confrontation that did not end in bloodshed at all? It was Sarah, once again, who provided the unexpected key. She had been listening, as children sometimes do, from just inside the door while Chester and Virginia spoke on the porch, and she came to Chester early the next morning, before the sun had fully cleared the mountains, with a suggestion so simple, and yet so clever that Chester found himself almost laughing with relief once he had turned it over fully in his mind. "You do not have to kill him," Sarah said. "You only have to beat him. Everybody in town already believes you are the fastest gun in the territory. If you can prove it without anyone getting shot, that man will have no reason left to fight, because the only thing he truly wants is to know for certain. Isn't that so? He said as much himself from what you told Aunt Virginia. He wants to know if he's truly faster than you or if the stories were wrong all along. How do you propose I prove such a thing without drawing against him for real?" Chester asked, though he was already beginning to see the shape of the idea taking form in his mind. "A contest," Sarah said. "Not a gunfight where somebody has to get shot, just a test of speed, same as you might race horses or throw an axe at a target. Sheriff Boone could judge it fair, and the whole town could watch. And if you beat him clean, with no blood spilled at all, then everybody will know the truth of it, and that man will have no more reason to want you dead, because his question will already be answered." Chester rode into Larkspur that morning and put the proposal to Wade Colton directly, in front of Sheriff Boone and a gathering crowd of curious townsfolk who had heard rumors of the coming confrontation and turned out in numbers to see how it might resolve. Wade Colton considered the suggestion with obvious suspicion at first, clearly expecting some manner of trick, but Sheriff Boone, sensing an opportunity to see the matter settled without violence, offered to set up a fair contest himself, using a simple target and a stopwatch borrowed from the general store's owner, a test of pure speed rather than a fight to the death. "If Keating beats you clean," Sheriff Boone said, "with witnesses enough to settle the question for good, will you agree to leave this territory and take Grant's blood money elsewhere, and leave Miss Prescott and her family in peace. Wade Colton's pride, it seemed, could not resist the challenge, particularly once the assembled crowd made clear their eager interest in seeing the contest play out, and he agreed, with the confident swagger of a man who still believed, deep down, that the old stories about Chester Keating's speed had been exaggerations born of frightened men's imaginations. They stood 20 paces apart in the street outside the saloon at noon, precisely as originally planned, though now with a wooden target set up between them rather than each other, and Sheriff Boone counted down the moment with the whole town watching in tense silence, Virginia and the children among them. Virginia's hand gripping Sarah's shoulder so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Chester's hand moved the instant Sheriff Boone dropped his own hand as the signal, and his shot struck dead center of the target, a full quarter second before Wade Colton had even cleared his holster, a gap so decisive that a murmur ran through the assembled crowd, and Wade Colton himself stood frozen for a long moment, staring at his own gun still only half drawn, before a strange, almost relieved expression crossed his face, as though some long-carried burden of uncertainty had finally, definitively, been lifted from his shoulders. "Well," Wade Colton said, holstering his weapon slowly, "I suppose that settles the question once and for all. You were always faster, Keating. I have spent 6 years wondering, and now I know, and I find I am oddly grateful to finally have my answer, even if it isn't the one I wanted." "There's no shame in it," Chester said, and found that he meant the word sincerely, understanding better than most men alive exactly how heavily such questions of reputation could weigh upon a man's soul. "You're a fast gun, Colton, faster than most men will ever be. But speed isn't worth throwing away a life over, yours or anybody else's. Take Grant's money if you already collected it, and go find some other territory to make your name in, one that doesn't involve threatening women and children who never did you any wrong." Wade Colton nodded slowly, and within the hour had collected his gear from the boarding house and ridden out of Larkspur, never to return, and word reached the town some weeks later that he had indeed taken up work as a stock detective for a large cattle association in Montana Territory, a job that suited his particular skills without requiring him to threaten innocent families on behalf of men too cowardly to fight their own battles. Silas Grant, upon learning that his hired gun had abandoned the field without firing a single shot, and facing the added weight of the circuit judge's earlier ruling and injunction, seemed finally to accept that the Prescott homestead was not worth the trouble it continued to cost him, and made no further attempts to seize the land or its water rights, choosing instead, in the years that followed, to focus his ambitions elsewhere in the county, leaving Virginia Prescott and her family at long last in genuine and lasting peace. The town of Larkspur celebrated the resolution with an impromptu gathering at the saloon that stretched long into the evening, and Chester found himself, for the first time in his life, toasted and celebrated not for his speed with a gun in service of violence, but for his willingness to use that same speed in service of peace, a distinction that mattered to him more than any praise he had ever received in his previous life as a hired gun. It was 2 weeks later, on a crisp November evening with the first snow of the season dusting the mountains white in the distance, that Chester Keating asked Virginia Prescott to marry him, kneeling in the same yard where she had once taught him to waltz, with all 4 children gathered on the porch behind her, having been let in on the secret plan that very afternoon and sworn, with great solemnity, to absolute secrecy. "Virginia Prescott," Chester said, his voice steadier than he had expected it to be, given how thoroughly his heart was pounding in his chest. "I came into this territory a man who believed he had nothing left to offer anybody except trouble and an early grave. You and these children have shown me that a man can be more than the worst things he has done, more than the reputation that follows him, if he is only given the chance and the reason to become something better. I love you with everything I have left to give, and I love Sarah and Thomas and Emma and Daniel as though they were my own flesh and blood, and I am asking you now in front of them, because I want them to know exactly how serious I am about staying, about building a home with you that no one, not Grant, not Colton, not anybody, could ever tear apart. Will you marry me?" Virginia, tears streaming freely down her face, sank to her knees in the frosty grass to meet him at eye level and pressed her forehead against his. "I have loved you since you stood in that street with your hand near your gun and something gentle in your eyes that told me you would never truly use it against anyone who didn't deserve it," she said. "Yes, Chester Keating. Yes, 1,000 times yes, and I promise you, in front of God and these children and this whole wide territory, that I will spend the rest of my life grateful that you rode into Larkspur that summer day and decided to stay." The children erupted in cheers from the porch, Thomas whooping loudly enough to startle the horses in the corral, and Emma running down the porch steps to throw her small arms around both of them at once, declaring with the absolute confidence of a 5-year-old that she had known all along this was going to happen, and that she intended to be the flower girl, a role she had apparently been researching in detail from Mrs. Coyle for several weeks already. They were married the following spring, in the same church whose cracked bell had never been repaired, on a bright April morning in 1879, with the whole town of Larkspur turned out to witness the ceremony. Sheriff Boone standing as best man, Obed Fisk giving away the bride in place of the father she no longer had, and all 4 children arranged proudly at the front of the church, Sarah serving as maid of honor with a bouquet of wildflowers she had picked herself along the creek bank that very morning. Thomas standing tall beside Chester in a borrowed suit 2 sizes too large, Emma scattering flower petals down the aisle with tremendous ceremony, and little Daniel, now 3 years old, sitting quietly in Mrs. Coyle's lap throughout the entire service, watching the proceedings with wide, solemn eyes. Virginia wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully altered and pressed for the occasion, and when Chester saw her walking down that aisle toward him, he found himself unable to speak for several long moments, overcome by a happiness so complete and so unexpected that it left him, for once in his life, entirely without words. A man who had built his old reputation on the speed of his hands, now rendered speechless by the simple sight of the woman he loved walking toward a future neither of them had dared to imagine possible only a year before. The Reverend, an elderly and kindly man named Reverend Tawley, who had presided over more weddings and funerals in that small church than he could easily count, spoke briefly during the ceremony about the peculiar grace that sometimes finds people in the most unexpected circumstances, noting that few in the congregation that day would have predicted, a year earlier, that the fastest gun ever to pass through Larkspur would end his career not with a bullet but with a wedding ring, and that fewer still would have predicted that Virginia Prescott, who had fought so hard and so long to protect her sister's orphaned children from every manner of threat this territory could produce, would find in that same reformed gunslinger not another danger to guard against but the steady, gentle partner she and those children had needed all along. "Love," Reverend Tawley said, looking out over the gathered congregation, "has a way of finding the people who need it most, often in forms nobody expected, and asking of us only that we be brave enough to recognize it when it arrives and humble enough to accept it once we do." Chester and Virginia exchanged their vows beneath the church's stained glass window, promising to love and honor and protect each other, and the children through whatever hardships this territory might yet throw at them. And when Chester finally kissed his bride before the assembled town, the cheer that rose up from the congregation was loud enough, Obed Fisk claimed afterward, to be heard clear out at the Prescott homestead itself, 3 miles distant, though this was almost certainly an exaggeration born of the general joy of the occasion, rather than any literal truth. They settled into married life on the homestead that had once belonged to Eleanor and her husband, and which Virginia had fought so hard to preserve, and Chester threw himself into the work of building a genuine future there, with an energy and dedication that surprised even Obed Fisk, who had, after all, been the first person in Larkspur to recognize something worth trusting in the quiet stranger who had ridden into town that summer day looking for nothing more than temporary work and a place to rest. The homestead prospered in the years that followed. Chester's steady hands, once known throughout the territory for their speed with a gun, proved equally capable at building fences that stood firm against any weather, at breaking horses with a patience that made him locally renowned among the ranchers of the county, and at teaching Thomas, and later Daniel as he grew older, the particular skills a young man needed to make his own way honestly in that hard and beautiful country. Skills that had nothing whatsoever to do with the fast draw that had once defined Chester's entire existence, and everything to do with the quiet, patient labor of raising cattle and putting up hay and building a life worth living. Sarah, who had shown such remarkable composure and cleverness during the troubles with Grant and Colton, grew into a young woman of considerable intelligence and determination, and when she turned 18 in the spring of 1883, she left Larkspur to attend a teacher's college in Cheyenne, a decision that filled Chester and Virginia both with tremendous pride, even as it left an ache in their hearts to see her go, an ache considerably eased by her promise to return each summer. A promise she kept faithfully, eventually coming home for good 3 years later to take up a position teaching in the very same Larkspur schoolhouse where she herself had once been a student, and where not. Incidentally, she met and eventually married a young rancher named Micah Holt, whose own family had settled in the valley not long after the Prescotts, giving Chester and Virginia grandchildren to spoil in the years that followed, a development that brought them both considerable and unexpected joy. Thomas grew into the cowboy he had always dreamed of becoming, working the Keating homestead alongside Chester through his teenage years, before eventually taking up work on his own modest spread of land purchased with money he had carefully saved, land that bordered the original Prescott claim, and that he worked with the same steady dedication Chester had shown him by example throughout his boyhood. Emma, the sweet and curious 5-year-old who had decided within her first week of knowing Chester that he was the finest person she had ever met, grew into a young woman known throughout the county for her kindness and her skill with horses, a skill Chester had cultivated in her from a very young age, and she eventually took over much of the management of the Keating homestead's growing herd, proving herself, by her early 20s, one of the most capable stock handlers in the entire valley, male or female. A fact that filled her adoptive father with a fierce and quiet pride he rarely spoke aloud, but which was visible to anyone who watched him watch her work. Daniel, who had been too young to remember a time before Chester Keating had been part of his life, grew up believing, in his heart if not in strict biological fact, that Chester was simply his father, full and complete, and Chester never once, in all the years that followed, gave the boy any reason to feel otherwise, raising him with the same devoted attention he gave to all the children who had come into his life, through circumstances none of them had chosen, but all of them had come, over time, to be profoundly grateful for. And there were more children still to come, for in the winter of 1880, less than 2 years after their wedding, Virginia gave birth to a son, whom they named William, after Chester's own father, a man Chester had lost at a young age and had rarely spoken of throughout his years as a gunslinger, but whose memory he found himself wanting to honor now that he had built the kind of life his father had always hoped for him. Before circumstances and grief had sent Chester down a much harder road in his younger years. William was followed, 2 years later, by a daughter they named Eleanor, after Virginia's sister, a name chosen with careful deliberation and no small amount of tears, meant to honor the woman whose loss had brought this unlikely family together in the first place, and whose memory, both Chester and Virginia agreed, deserved to live on in the joy of a new life rather than only in the grief of the one that had been lost. By the time young Eleanor had reached her 5th birthday, The Keating homestead along Larkspur Creek had grown into one of the most respected and prosperous small ranches in the county. Not the largest, not the wealthiest, but widely regarded, throughout the surrounding territory, as a home built on genuine partnership and hard-won peace. A place where a man once known as the fastest and most feared gun in the entire territory had proven, beyond any doubt, that his truest and most enduring skill lay not in speed or violence, but in the patient, deliberate work of loving people well and staying, through every hardship, exactly where he was needed most. Chester never entirely escaped his old reputation, of course. Strangers passing through Larkspur would occasionally recognize his name, would ask, with a mixture of curiosity and something close to awe, whether the stories about the fastest draw in the territory were truly all accurate. And Chester learned over the years to answer these questions honestly but without pride, acknowledging the hard truths of his younger years. The men he had killed in fights, he had told himself, were fair, even when the fairness of any gunfight was itself a questionable proposition. The reputation he had built at a cost he had not fully understood, until it very nearly cost him everything worth having. He spoke, when asked, of Dale Hutton, the frightened boy in Cheyenne whose shaking hand had finally shown Chester the true emptiness of the life he had been living. And he spoke, too, of the family he had found in Larkspur, the woman with the hay rake who had refused to be moved off her sister's land, and the 4 children who had taught him that courage came in more forms than simply the speed of a man's draw. The fastest gun in the territory, he told his own grandchildren, decades later, gathered around him on the porch of the same homestead where he had once knelt in the frosty grass to ask Virginia Prescott to be his wife, is not a thing worth being remembered for, children. If you remember me for anything at all when I am gone, I hope it is not for how fast my hand once moved, but for how long I managed to stay, once I finally found people worth staying for. Virginia Prescott Keating lived a long and full life beside the man who had once been the most feared gunslinger in the Wyoming Territory, watching their family grow across 2 generations, watching the raw, dangerous frontier of their youth slowly give way to more settled and civilized country, watching Larkspur itself grow from a scattering of struggling homesteads into a proper town with a school and a proper church bell finally replaced, and a railroad spur that connected them, at last, to the wider world beyond the mountains. She never forgot the woman she had been in that dusty street, standing alone with nothing but a hay rake and her own fierce determination to protect what remained of her sister's family. And she never forgot the quiet stranger who had stepped between her and danger without ever once drawing his gun against men, who, by every account of his old reputation, he could have killed in the space of a single breath. "You saved us," she told him once, many years later, as they sat together on the porch watching their grandchildren play in the yard where their own children had once played, where Emma had first thrown her small arms around them both in unrestrained joy. That day in the street. "You saved all of us." "No," Chester said, taking her weathered hand in his own, still steady after all these years, though the speed that had once made it famous throughout the territory had long since given way to a different, quieter kind of steadiness entirely. "You saved me, Virginia. I rode into this territory a man with nothing left to lose because I had already lost everything that mattered or thought I had. You and those children gave me something worth having, something worth protecting, something worth staying for. I did not save your family that day in the street. Your family saved mine, the only family I have ever truly had, the only one I ever wanted, though I did not know it until the moment I saw it standing right in front of me." And there, on that porch, in the golden light of a Wyoming evening many years after a frightened boy's shaking hand had first shown him the emptiness of the life he was living, Chester Keating, once the fastest draw in the entire territory, and Virginia Prescott, once a woman alone against the world with nothing but a hay rake and unbreakable determination, watched their grandchildren play in the long grass beside the creek that had once nearly cost them everything, and found in each other and in the family they had built together against every expectation the territory had once held for either of them. Exactly the kind of peace that neither of them had ever quite believed themselves capable of finding, and which both of them, in the end, agreed had been worth every hardship it had taken to arrive there.